Well, hello everybody. This is going to be another installment in the series of videos that I've made on circumcision and foreskin restoration. I don't want to cover everything. It's a big topic. I find it very interesting, and I think there's lots of aspects of it that you can really delve into. And in this, I don't want to go over everything. Maybe in some of the tangents, I'll cover some of it perfunctorily, but I mostly want to address one of the most common arguments you get in favor of continuing the practice on children. Um, and that is you'll be in the course of a debate bringing up points like um, circumcision, and I'm here referring to men because people seem to accept this argument without question when it comes to women, but not to men, which is an interesting example of sexism as far as I can tell, a rare actual example of sexism. But uh, the point will be made by an activist like me, for instance, that the removal of the foreskin reduces sensitivity, it reduces sexual function, and reduces sexual pleasure. That this is a bit of very sensitive tissue that's has many nerve endings. It's very innervate, if that's even a word, and that it evolved for a function. It has a function in sex, in foreplay, and in masturbation, and that this function is if not completely destroyed, largely retarded when it's removed. All sensation from the removed tissue is gone. Even the tissue that remains will lose sensitivity, especially in the glands. The glands are meant to be covered, and the fact that they're not results in a process of keratinization where the skin becomes much number, anywhere between 80 and 90%, although this does vary. There are bell curves here, both with people and with age. Tends to get worse as you get older. So a lot of guys, when they're 20 or 25, will say, "Oh no, I feel fine," but will not feel so fine when they're 35 or 45. Indeed, in my experience, a large proportion of those who become interested in restoring their foreskin are either gay, in which case they have a much greater experience level with uncircumcised penises, or they are straight, but they are more middle-aged. They're older. More in the 40 to 50 range, sometimes younger. There are younger straight guys who get interested in it, who experience a dramatic loss in sensitivity as they age. But in any event, the claim will be made that there's a loss of sensitivity and sexual function, and the retort will be from a guy who was circumcised at birth, and much more rarely from a guy who was circumcised later in life. That's obviously a much smaller group, and I have met people like that and talked to them, and their testimony is interesting, and it's a little bit more mixed, but that's another topic to go into. But guys who are circumcised at birth will say, don't, I feel fine, right? So the allegation that, well, you lost sensitivity, you lost sexual function, you lost sexual pleasure. Well, I feel sexual pleasure, therefore you're wrong. The circumcision doesn't entail the loss of sensitivity or sexual function. Now, this is a very interesting argument, but it's also a very bogus one. Now, if we're talking about advocating for the circumcision of infants, of going and having this done against their without their consent, you saying that you feel fine does not logically entail that then it is justified to do to other people. And this is not something that is limited only to circumcision, right? It's fine for you to say as an adult, as a consenting volitional actor, that I like tattoos, I like taking steroids, I like taking drugs, I like drinking, I like getting my ears pierced or lip discs or uh, uh, my earlobes extended, or working out a lot, or any number of other things, eating fast food, smoking. These are all choices that you're perfectly entitled to make. And if someone argues with you that you shouldn't do them, for you to say, well, I feel fine, I choose to do them and I feel fine, that is a valid explanation for your activities. But to then go, so we ought to do this to everyone, especially to unconsenting children, babies, infants, there is no logic train that entails that, right? Yeah, maybe you like tattoos, but you would, I mean, and I don't know anyone who would say, well, go ahead and then tattoo all the babies, or give them steroids, or anything else. There's a certain consensus that if we're talking about a medically necessary life-saving procedure, maybe they have cancer, maybe they need a vaccine, maybe they need some kind of surgery, that it's permissible to make decisions on the part of those unable to consent, whether they be children or whether they be comatose adults or adults who are incapacitated for some reason, maybe they're knocked out or whatever, but to do something that's essentially cosmetic uh, or has non-life-saving benefits. All right, so there are medical benefits to circumcision. This is one of the other interesting things. There's a grain of truth to the argument. Any body part that you can have, uh, your eyes, your nose, your lips, your testicles, uh, your hair, all these can have medical problems. You can get lice, you can get testicular cancer. If you're a woman, you can get breast cancer, and indeed many thousands of women die every year from breast cancer. And you can have problems with your foreskin. That's absolutely true. It's not a magical part of the body that can never have any kind of medical ailment. Now, most of the ailments that you can get in your foreskin or associated with your foreskin are relatively minor, and they are relatively rare. They're not something that you would automatically assume is going to be a problem. And so the idea that you would then just automatically remove them all, the calculus doesn't really work unless you say, well, there's no benefit, right? Sure, there's not a big medical advantage, but since there's no benefit to having a foreskin, you might as well do it. Now, this logic fails because it assumes that there's nothing lost, that it's just vestigial, that it's extra piece of skin, which is technically not even correct since there's muscle tissue involved. And when you're talking about the effect that circumcision has on the gland is not just skin, and there will be a massive effect on the gland as a result of circumcision. But this weighting of the scales where the cons, I mean, there are downsides to circumcision as well. You have a certain number that have botched circumcisions, and you also have this tremendous loss in sexual function, sexual pleasure. And you will have people say, well, there is no loss in sexual function and sexual pleasure because, quote, I feel fine. I was circumcised at birth. I enjoy sex. I like having sex. I like masturbating. Therefore, there was no loss. Now, that isn't logically true either, right? If I come to you and say, you were robbed, that the bank made an error and removed, you know, a lot of fun, some fraction of funds, a large amount of money from your account. For you to retort, well, I still have lots of money in there, so that's not true. No, it just means that you had enough money that maybe you have a lot left over, but that doesn't say that you didn't lose anything, right? To say that you feel fine doesn't mean that you wouldn't feel even better had it not happened. Now, and this is what I think is so pernicious about the practice. Once a guy is circumcised at birth, he has no idea firsthand anyway. Maybe he can get some inkling secondhand, and that's I think what's happened with me. And you know, people who decide to restore their foreskins often have this perspective, but he'll have no firsthand knowledge of what he is missing. And so when he is told that he is losing something, the chances are he's going to say, no, I feel fine now, and that I'm not missing anything. But he has no point of reference. He has never felt what it was like to be uncircumcised. And it's not just a question of being more sensitive. There are additional different sensations for which a person who is circumcised at birth has no conceptual awareness. And this is a very difficult thing to parse out when you're talking about interpersonal, experiential sensations. It's very hard, and it's even hard. It's not just that cut guys do not understand what it's like to be uncut. Uncut guys do not understand what it's like to be cut. Right? They are hamstrung in a similar way in the sense that they do not know where the sensation that they have now would be different if they were circumcised. Now, aesthetically, it's not too hard. You can, if for most uncut guys, you can retract your foreskins and get some idea of what you would look like, although not entirely. There is damage done when you're circumcised at birth that is not going to be done if you get circumcised later in life. The glands of an uncircumcised guy are much smoother, much glossier, much more moist. The moistness will go away if you get circumcised when you're an adult, but the smoothness of the glands will not. And when you have, well, not initially anyway. When you're circumcised at birth, the glands are permanently scarred. The foreskin is fused to the head of the penis at least 99% of the time in newborns. And in order to circumcise them, the membrane that fuses the head to the glands is basically ripped. They'll use forceps or some kind of probe and go in there and rip it to pieces, almost like sticking something under your fingernail to dislodge the fingernail from your finger. You can imagine how painful this would probably be, and the screams of the babies indicate that it indeed very much is. And this will scarify both this inner skin, which is about to be cut off so you'll never see, but also the gland itself. And you can see this very clearly if you look at a guy who is circumcised up close. You will see that it is covered in minuscule fissures, crevices, cracks. This is scarification, and it's also a result of dryness. Now, this is so ubiquitous and has always been present in a cut guy that he doesn't see this as a scar or an injury or anomalous in any way. If he ever encounters an uncircumcised guy and gets a close look at his head, he will notice how much smoother it is, and say nothing of glossier and moister. And that is something that, if you get circumcised as an adult, you won't actually experience to the same degree, because your skin is already not fused to your head, and they don't need to rip it off the head in order to circumcise you, at least in the vast majority of cases. So it's difficult because an uncircumcised guy does not know where the sensation that he currently feels would be cut down to, right? Also, the distinction between the foreskin and the rest of the penis is a somewhat arbitrary one. They are all part of a penis. And you don't know how much of your head sensitivity would change. There's a lot of erogenous sensation for most uncut guys that is associated with the frenulum band, the very tip of the foreskin, the elastic area that hugs the head. All right. Now, this is something that is completely absent in cut guys. Now, again, there are bell curves here. I've met uncut guys who that area didn't seem to be particularly sensitive, but I've met others where any kind of stimulation there at all produced an extremely strong erogenous response that had no corollary with circumcised guys. And actually, this was the very first thing, long before I met anyone who was uncircumcised. This was my very first inkling that there might be something more to this story. I remember I had a friend, a straight friend in Iceland, a cool guy who once I had become friendly enough with that I could talk to him. And this is long before I was meeting guys. This is long before I had any first-hand experience with guys who were uncircumcised. I was asking him, once it wasn't awkward, once I knew him well enough that we could have a conversation like this, what kind of sensations he had. And it was very interesting because he was talking about how just being kissed very lightly or even blown, not like as an oral sex, but just like a little stream of air on the tip of his skin, was extremely pleasurable and erogenous. And I grant that not all uncut guys feel exactly the same way or react to this as strongly, but he said it would make his entire body shiver, that he would shake and moan, and that it was extremely erogenous. And now, having met uncut guys, I can attest that this is a very common reaction. But there is no analogy to that in circumcised guys. They don't have that tissue. They've never felt that. They don't know what that is even like, and how, like, they can't imagine it. And so to them to say, well, I feel fine, they don't even know that they've lost that, right? And there's more that could be said. Stimulating the inside of the skin while simultaneously stimulating the head, say by sticking in the tongue or the finger. And I apologize if this is graphic, but it's necessary in this case. This also produces a very, very strong result. Now, again, bell curves, they don't always act the same, but I've had guys who I thought were going to kick out the floor of my vehicle just by sticking, a finger going in like this, very lightly going around. And I'll say this is the head of their penis, this is my finger, and imagine that the skin is wrapped around. That is intensely, intensely sensational, right? And not in an erogenous way, but also just in a very hypersensitive way. And it's so sensitive that there are some guys who actually prefer you not to touch them in that way, that it's a little too much. But most can take it, and most actually really enjoy it. What's fascinating is if you go to a circumcised guy and you gently touch the top of their head like this, the reaction is going to be nothing. They're going to say, "What are you doing? What's going on?" I mean, it might be an erogenous situation, so they're aroused for that reason. But in terms of sensory perception, they're not feeling anything at all or very, very little. And this is in marked contrast to a guy who is uncircumcised. And it's not simply a case of having the sensitivity tuned up. It is a qualitatively different sensation. All right. And the second thing that my friend in Iceland pointed out, and this is another thing for which Cut Guy has no analogy, is when he was masturbating or when he's having sex, the gliding action, I think there's a technical term for it that escapes me right now, but the action of the end of the foreskin, the prepuce, gliding on and off the head is extremely pleasurable. And this is how an uncut guy is typically going to masturbate one way or another, either by grabbing the tip and pulling it over, or grabbing the shaft and pushing and pulling it over, or through anal sex or vaginal sex. And it appears that the foreskin evolved to accommodate vaginal sex with this extra skin, with this end bit of skin, this very sensitive, specialized tip of the penis, and that is extremely erogenous. But if you are circumcised, especially if you're circumcised at birth, you have nothing that is equivalent to that or even close to that. Most circumcised guys will masturbate by directly rubbing the head. A few who have been circumcised less severely and have a little bit of skin may be able to pull some of the skin over their head when they're hard. Most can't. That's rather unusual. That's either an indication of a atypically loose circumcision, or also possibly from some kind of daily routine that has extended the length of the skin. There are guys who inadvertently essentially begin to restore their penises because they restore their foreskins in such a the way they masturbate or some other tick or common movement tug on the skin and slowly make it grow. And I have actually met people who look uncircumcised, who were circumcised, but by kind of habitually tugging on the skin, eventually regrew it and covered their head completely. But this is actually quite rare and unusual. But most guys can't do that. But even the guys who can, that is only a tiny, tiny fraction, right? The specialized cells in the frontal band, the inner skin, and the amount of skin are much, much, much less. The sensitivity of head is much, much, much less. The frenulums are damaged to different degrees in circumcision. Sometimes they are entirely gone, and sometimes they are almost entirely left intact. Usually, they're mostly gone or heavily damaged, although there's typically some remnant left. This is really important because the frenulum is very sensitive, and it also affects the physical function, the mechanics of the skin coming in, gliding on and off the head. This is something that a guy who is maybe a little bit extra skin but was still circumcised is not going to have. So when a guy says, I feel fine, he doesn't know what he's missing. He doesn't know what is gone, and he has no ability to assess that. The other thing is the damage from circumcision is cumulative and takes time. The fact that your head is exposed is not its natural environment. It is supposed to be covered by your skin, at least mostly, if not entirely. And again, guys who are uncut do vary in this. There are guys who have, quote, short foreskins, where some or even most, or in probably very rare cases, I've never seen one, but it's hypothetically possible, essentially all of the head is uncovered. But that is very unusual. Most guys, at least when they're flaccid, are mostly or almost entirely covered. When you are uncovered all the time, you will experience a lot of abrasion and friction, and your skin will be constantly encountering tissue that is less conducive to being in contact with your head than the inner skin of your foreskin would be. And the effect is that a cumulative loss of sensitivity in the gland itself. It slowly loses sensitivity. There's a process called keratization, where a buildup of basically callus cells on the head to protect it, right? This is a natural response to a wound that is exactly what happened in the surgery when you were cut. And this helps protect, but it also numbs. And this becomes progressively worse with age. If you look at the community of people who are interested in restoring their foreskins, they're a disproportionate number of gay men, which makes sense since they're going to have a lot more direct experience with foreskins and have a much better idea of what they might be missing, relative to straight men who may have zero experience or very, very minimal experience with foreskins, perhaps not more than the extent that occasionally they see them in the locker room or in the bathroom. Even then, that's not necessarily common anymore. And but among straight men, it's much more common as they get older, right? So you feel fine when you're 20, you feel fine when you're 25, maybe you feel fine when you're 30, maybe you feel fine when you're 40, but at some point, it's very common for there to be a gradual and even a drastic loss in sensitivity, sexual function, and the ability to orgasm. And I think, in my case, I think I started to experience that at the initial stages of that right around 31, 32. Wasn't very dramatic, and soon thereafter I started restoring, and there was a massive leap in the other direction in terms of sexual function and sensitivity. There's a lot of guys 35, 45, 55 who notice this. And you know, if you go to the gym or you get the chance to, and you get to see older gentlemen naked, both cut and uncut, you will see that there is deterioration of the body generally, right? I mean, and this is just goes with aging, right? An older guy is going to have signs of deterioration that a younger guy is not, even if he's relatively physically fit. And I know there's several guys in their 60s and even 70s at my gym who are in great shape, not just for their age, but generally. But you can still see the deterioration, especially dermally, especially on the skin. The glands of the head age very badly. All right, they become grayish, crack. They start to crack. They get, they lose any apparent elasticity. This is apparent elasticity. I don't know from actual physical contact, and this is in marked difference from uncut older men. Right? If you see an older man, even if he's the same age, even if his body is in worse shape, when he retracts his foreskin, which sometimes you get a chance to see because they'll do this to clean, or it just accidentally happens, their head will be glossy, red, smooth, and from a visual standpoint, brand new. Now, I'm sure it's also older. They are still a man who's aging. It's not like a foreskin is the fountain of youth, but the head will age much, much, much better. And I actually recently met a guy who's a nurse, and I mentioned this too, and he confirmed that he had a patient who was in his 90s who he needed to be cleaned by the nursing staff, and that his uncut penis, the head of it was like brand new. The rest of his body was wasted away and whatnot, and to the point where he needed someone to help clean him. But when he would retract the foreskin, his head was still good as new. At least visually. In terms of what he felt, you know, he didn't experiment, but I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that he would feel more. If you are uncut, and I have a lot of guys who subscribe to my channel who are not Americans, who are from Europe, who are uncircumcised, it's difficult for you to understand exactly how bad this would be. But one thing you can do is if you can retract your skin permanently, or at least not permanently, but temporarily, say with tape or string, pull it back so your head is exposed. And go ahead and put on your clothes. Put on a pair of boxers or your underwear, and you will immediately feel the irritation of the fabric and the abrasion of the fabric rubbing up against your head. And this varies from annoying to painful with uncut guys. Again, there are bell curves. They don't all react exactly the same way, but it's actually very, very difficult. You find it irritating and it's annoying. But this is where, and I wouldn't advise that you continue to do it. But if you were to continue to do that for days and days, week after week after week, what would happen is the irritation would subside because your sensitivity would start to decrease. And while that's good in the sense that you won't be irritated as much, and the numbness is your head protecting itself because it's not being protected by your skin, that reduction in sensitivity is not restricted to when you put on underwear. It's going to carry over to when you masturbate, when you have sex, when you engage in oral sex. There's going to be a corresponding loss in sensitivity. Now, again, this varies. Not all cut guys are similarly unsensitive, and not all uncut guys have the exact same. They certainly don't. But the bell curves are clearly the peaks are clearly separated, even if the descending trough on the uncut and intersects some of the cut. Sure, but that's not a very compelling argument, like in favor of circumcision. And again, it's not just sensitivity. There are basic erogenous differences. There are qualitative differences. Um, it's not uncommon. I mean, it is very tricky because like an uncut guy, because he's not sure how much is from his foreskin and how much is not, he's not going to identify the foreskin specifically as a point of pleasure necessarily. Some of them do. The ones who are more cognizant and tuned into their bodies are aware, and there is evidence that for some guys, explicitly the foreskin is like the center of their sexuality. This isn't true for everyone, obviously, but it's true for a lot. And for those that it's not the case, it's mostly that they are simply not analyzing it very much. And why should they? Right? You wouldn't look at your penis and go, well, this part of the shaft is really important to my sexuality, but this other part is more or less, and this other part is more or less. It's just your penis, and you don't go, oh, well, this part I like a lot, and this part I don't like a lot. Unless there's some kind of ailment or obvious abrasion or something like that, you're not going to demarcate different parts and then assign them sexual relevance. And if you're uncut, you're probably not going to do that either, unless you're really hyper aware. And to an extent, even then, it is somewhat arbitrary how much of how much of it would be cut off and whatnot. So I think this is another problem with the issue, is that then uncut guys are reluctant or unable to form an advocacy group because they look at it like, well, I don't know what would be different. I can't go to a circumcised guy and explain to him what it is he's missing, because I don't even know what I would be missing. But when guys who are cut at birth say, well, I feel fine, that's not a good test case. The test case is a guy who is uncut. How does he feel about it? Does he value his foreskin, or does he think that it's something that the medical benefits of circumcision are such that it justifies getting removed? Now, people who survive to sexual maturity with intact foreskins do sometimes get circumcised, but the overwhelming majority don't. All right, the overwhelming majority of guys who are uncircumcised and go through adolescence uncircumcised have no desire to remove their foreskin. In the United States, it's rare, but even when it does happen, oftentimes it's because of a medical industry that vigorously overprescribes circumcision for all kinds of ailments that it doesn't require, that hypes the medical benefits and completely discounts the downside, that there is no downside at all. And I've had guys, some very heartbreaking stories. I've met guys who were circumcised but clearly had been circumcised in adolescence or later in life because their head was in perfect shape. And when I asked them, hey, were you circumcised? I'm thinking about one guy in particular here, but I could enumerate this story with a couple different analogies. Who I asked, were you circumcised when you were older? And the guy I'm thinking in his case was, yeah, he said he got circumcised when he was 17. He was uncut. He enjoyed his foreskin. It felt great. He loved playing with it. And he had phimosis. Now, phimosis is where the head of the foreskin it's too tight and can't be retracted over the head of the back behind the head. Now, there's different gradients of this, right? There are guys who can pull it back behind the head, but then it will not go back unless they become soft. And I've met several guys who are like that. It doesn't seem to be particularly a big problem, although it could be awkward in sex. There are other guys who can't pull it all the way back, but maybe pull it halfway back. And then there are people who can't pull it back at all. I've known guys who have literally never seen their head, that the opening of the foreskin is relatively small, and in the case I'm thinking of here, relatively inelastic, and they have never seen their head, even though they might be 30 years old. Now, in this guy's case, he could retract the foreskin all the way. Even when he was hard, it would just get stuck behind the head. Now, there are non-surgical remedies for this. Your skin can be made to expand quite easily. They make graduated discs for this that you can buy online for like 20 bucks, and it usually takes, for most guys, less than 6 weeks to go from unable to fully retract to fully retract. It's much cheaper and safer than surgery and allows you to retain your foreskin, but there are probably not one doctor in 100 in the United States that is even aware of this, and even fewer who would suggest it. And part of that could be simple incentive. They can charge for the surgery where they're not going to be able to charge for the graduated discs that you can buy online for $20. But I think it's more a case of institutional ignorance and just a bias against foreskin in general. Anyway, so this guy had phimosis and was told by his doctor that he needed to be circumcised, and that it was all right because everything would feel the same. He would lose no sexual sensation, no sensation at all. It would be just like before. He wouldn't have a foreskin. Well, he's a 17-year-old kid. Who is he to second guess a doctor, a urologist, presumably, although I don't know, or a pediatric surgeon? I don't know what type of doctor it was. And so he got circumcised. And he said that it was like he could feel nothing. All right, the difference was that he could not feel anything after. This is after the bandages and he's healed and he can manipulate his penis as he likes. The loss of sensation was so extreme that he couldn't orgasm, he couldn't get off. He said he cried himself to sleep for months after this, and that it took a very long time before he was able to learn how to ejaculate after the loss, and that he can ejaculate now, and although he didn't say so, I'm pretty sure he's married and has children, but he didn't say that. I'm just inferring that from some clues. But he says that it has never been anywhere close to as pleasurable as it was up until the time he was circumcised. And I've had that repeated a couple times. Now, sometimes guys get circumcised when they're adulthood, and they say that they feel fine, that they're very happy with it, and that they're being honest about that. And that's true, although that's certainly a minority. And they're also only at the beginning stages, right? So if you're newly circumcised, a lot of the sensory loss might happen much later. A lot of times guys get circumcised for psychological reasons. I'm thinking now of another guy who I'd met 3 years ago, beautiful, uncut, perfectly healthy foreskin, could fully retract, no hint of phimosis. And when I met him again, approximately 2.5, 3 years later, he was circumcised. And, I asked what the problem was, and he said, well, he just wanted it done. And it turned out that somebody had made fun, somebody had said that it was gross and they didn't want to see him, and he had basically internalized that. He only referenced one instance, so I don't know if this was something that he faced constantly. It seems to be, by and large, most gay guys seem to be fairly accepting of it, but there are certainly some who are not. And he just had an internalized shame about it, that it was dirty and whatnot, and so he got circumcised. And he was rationalizing that he felt happy about it, although when I asked about sensitivity, he said, well, it's trickier now, and the way that he masturbates has fundamentally changed. And he didn't say, I won't misconstrue him and say that he wasn't happy with it. He said that he was, but I did detect more than a grain of doubt in his answers. Maybe that's just me reading into it, but when you get circumcised for that reason, because of peer pressure or because of social pressure or because of shame, because you feel like you're unusual, it's very hard to then be unbiased, because you have, and this is true of me as well, right? Like this is such a personal thing that to actually find a case that's objective would probably be literally impossible. But I will say that I try and be aware of my bias and to acknowledge that there is a bias there. So even he, though, admitted that it was fundamentally different, right? That the way that he jerked off and the way that it felt was different. He still said he was happy about it, but the reasons he gave were not because he was having sexual dysfunction. It was because he felt shame because somebody had criticized him or made fun of him. At least one. I have a feeling that it happened probably more than once, but because it seems like a lot to go through. But even this, fine. He was an adult. He decided to get this done when he was in his late 20s or early 30s. That's perfectly fine. To then say it should be done to children is a huge, enormous leap. that is not logically followed by any of that. So, you know, if and there's another element to this. If you say, well, fine, granted, maybe I'm missing out in sexual function, right? And maybe I'm not feeling as much as I normally would. I should just move past it, right? I shouldn't dwell on it. I shouldn't make it a big issue. And there's a certain logic to that, right? Like it's not good to always dwell on the past and to always feel bad about stuff that happened to you previously. Of course, this does inform a lot about whether we should do this to children or not. And the answer is clearly no, we shouldn't. Um, you know, the circular argument that like, well, we'll do it to them. Yes, it's going to reduce their sexual function and sexual pleasure, but that's fine because we will have, by doing it when they're infants, eliminated their knowledge of this, and they will be blissfully ignorant of what they're missing, at least most of them, most of the time, right? And that's assuming the ones that don't have complications from circumcision, which there are. They're common enough that I've seen them. I mean, the whole procedure is a complication as far as I'm concerned, but even accepting the terms of circumcision, there are ones that are bad, and to accept that this happened to the degree that it does is questionable at the very least. Um, Things like skin bridges, overly tight circumcisions, damage to the gland, uh, even sex reassignment in extreme cases where so much is taken off that the penis needs to be removed. That's very, very rare, but it does happen. Um, it seems like a really strained argument to say, well, doing it to kids is fine because they'll never know what was missing, so it's okay to, you know, deny them this element of their humanity. I think that that's totally ridiculous. It is maybe arguable that you say, well, it was done to me, there's nothing I can do about it, which by the way is false. There is stuff you can do about it, but you may choose that you don't want to, and then it's better for you just to move on. That's fine for you personally, but then to make the leap that that should be done to everyone, or should be the approach that everyone has, is quite limited. So um, yeah, the fact that you feel fine doesn't mean that you aren't missing out on a great deal. It's not an argument for making, you know, assuming that others will feel fine or that you have the right to make that choice for other people. There's the convolution here of, you know, don't parents have the right to make that choice? And well, in general, we don't seem to, most people, it's very rare to find people who think that parents have the right to do whatever they want to their children, that there are boundaries to what they can do. So parents cannot decide to kill their children or to mutilate their children, right? If a parent said, well, we want to chop off their hands, or, you know, if they're girls, circumcise them, people would find that ghastly and barbaric. Uh, Drawing the line to include you know, circumcising young boys, but not those other things is quite arbitrary. It's very unclear why, you know, piercing the ears or tattooing is wrong, but cutting off the most sensitive part of the penis is just fine. It's just a huge example of special pleading, and one that can't be really rationalized except by invoking cultural conservatism, uh, which is not a sufficient justification for a surgery like this that's going to radically change the sexual universe of the boy involved, and any of his partners for that matter. So, um, yeah. Uh, it's a fascinating topic. I do think I will be doing an update video on the foreskin restoration, since that is making progress. In my previous video where I talked about it, I was more abstract and less personal. I think I will make one that is more personal eventually. Like I said, I'm going to leave for several months, and the reason they're getting several videos in a row here is for that reason, by the way. I would normally want to wait, but since I'm going to literally leave in like 3 days from now, and my ability to upload videos from then is probably quite limited, I wanted to get this out there. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. This is a fascinating topic, one that for some reason people have a lot of inhibitions about discussing openly, which is one reason I'm motivated to make these videos. I think it is something that is worthy of debate. If you are uncircumcised, I think that it's justified for you to consider bringing your perspective to light more than they do. There seems to be almost no movement among uncircumcised Americans, of which there are many millions, who, you know, have anything to say about circumcision, which is, I understand, but lament also. It seems like almost all the activism is coming from guys who were circumcised and who resent it for whatever reason. And while I understand that, if you are uncircumcised, you have a lot that you could add to this. I'm not saying that you need to, that there's an obligation morally to do it, but just that uh, you would have a valuable perspective. And you know, what all do we yearn for in life if not to have a valuable opinion that can sway society one way or another, right? So anyway, I will talk to you all later and have a good day.